A severed head can stay conscious for up to 30 seconds after it's chopped off. It's a shocking half-minute where the eyes might blink, the lips might try to speak, and awareness lingers as life slips away. For Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife and probably the most famous queen ever to be beheaded, this chilling possibility was just one part of her execution that many accounts make seem less gruesome than it really was. The true tale of Anne's final moments tells a story of psychological agony, far worse than just a sword swing. Her execution was a carefully staged political event meant to destroy not just her life, but also her legacy. It shows just how brutal Tudor England's justice system was, where death was just the end of a humiliating spectacle. While many history books merely state that she was executed for treason, her last days were filled with a psychological breakdown so precise that even today's torturers would take notes. Anne's execution wasn't just an end, it was the climax of Henry VIII's mission to erase a woman who had become uncomfortable powerful. By May 19, 1536, Anne had already spent 17 days locked up in the Tower of London, the very place where she'd once prepared for her coronation. Just 3 years before, she had celebrated being crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now she awaited her death in an eerie limbo, with the king constantly delaying it, extending her mental torment. He even brought in a master swordsman from Calais to carry out the beheading, instead of using the usual English axe. This detail was often spun as a kindness, but really it just highlighted how theatrical the whole event was. In her last hours, Anne showed an almost unnatural calm. Witnesses described her as cheerful, even while facing death. Modern psychologists might call it dissociation. It's a mental defense mechanism that kicks in during extreme trauma. She even joked that she'd be remembered as Anne without a head, showing gallows humor that masked her inner struggle. But few histories admit the sheer horror she must have felt knowing her reputation was being shattered by false charges of adultery, incest, and plotting the king's murder. What makes Anne's execution so deeply unsettling isn't just the act of beheading itself, but the entire calculated devastation of her spirit. Henry wanted more than just Anne's death. He aimed to wipe her from the pages of history, to erase her achievements, and to undermine her daughter Elizabeth. The execution was the grim conclusion of a smear campaign aimed at convincing the public that this once-admired queen deserved her fate. In the days leading up to her death, Anne endured shocking, made-up stories about her so-called sexual misconduct, claims so absurd they'd be thrown out in any modern court. On the morning of May 19th, the sky was unusually bright in London, a sharp contrast to the horror that was about to happen. Anne spent her last night praying, though sleep was elusive. Tower records say she asked for communion at 2 a.m., kneeling there for hours, desperately seeking peace. By dawn, she'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, her mind likely frayed from stress. When the Tower lieutenant came to get her, she was reportedly laughing with her ladies, not a sign of calm, but a signal of her mental strain. Her execution had been postponed multiple times, a cruel form of psychological torture. The waiting game of not knowing when her end would come was intentional. When she finally learned it was time, Anne was led from her chamber through the same corridors where she once walked as queen. Now, guards were by her side, not out of honor, but to stop her from escaping. Those same courtiers who once bowed to her now looked on with cold indifference. The scaffold at Tower Green was surprisingly low, just 3 feet above the ground, Unlike the towering platforms seen in movies, this choice stripped Anne of any dignity, forcing her to climb just a few steps and keeping her close to a jeering crowd. While modern portrayals show audiences behaving respectfully, historical accounts suggest a festive, almost carnival-like atmosphere. The execution was a public spectacle, a warning to anyone who dared defy the king, especially women who aspired to rise above their station. Before kneeling at the block, Anne was granted a final speech, not out of compassion, but because tradition required it. Her words were carefully chosen, revealing. Anne was trapped in a tough spot. She said, "Good Christian people, I've come here to die. The law says I must, so I won't argue." This might seem like she accepted her fate, but it was really her last stand. By acknowledging the law but not admitting guilt, she was quietly questioning whether the charges were valid at all. What's even more shocking, the king wasn't there. Unlike how royal executions are usually portrayed, Henry VIII stayed at Whitehall Palace, waiting for news of Anne's death. As her head was severed, he was reportedly celebrating his upcoming wedding to Jane Seymour. This showed just how discarded Anne had become. Her death turned from personal tragedy to a political move, just a necessary step for the king in his quest for a son. The executioner, a skilled swordsman from Killala, was brought in for a hefty fee. This choice added another layer of cruelty. Typical English beheadings used axes, which often needed multiple strikes to finish the job, but this French swordsman, he was more likely to succeed in one clean cut, yet he was a stranger to Anne. In her last moments, she faced her end by the hands of someone unfamiliar, a final blow for a queen who had once captured the attention of an entire nation. The blindfold she wore, often thought of as mercy to shield her from the sight of the sword, actually had a practical purpose. It kept her from flinching, which could have ruined the execution. Anne knelt straight up instead of resting her head on the block, following another French custom that made the job harder for the executioner. It forced her to stay still through sheer determination, all while he readied his strike. Witnesses claimed she mumbled prayers, her eyes moving under the blindfold as she tried to catch any sound of the sword. That moment, knowing death was near but not knowing when, was a kind of psychological strain rarely talked about in tidy history books. The beheading itself happened in one clean stroke, but what came next is often left out of polite conversations about history. Her eyes and lips kept moving for several seconds after her head was cut off. It was a chilling response, a sign that oxygen was still in her brain. Some people even said her lips attempted to form words, possibly finishing the prayer she was saying when the sword struck. The scene was so distressing that some witnesses fainted, while others turned away in shock at this grim reminder of how fragile life is. What's shocking is that no real coffin was ready for Anne's remains. Her ladies, overwhelmed with grief, had to hurriedly find an arrow chest to put her head and body in. This small but telling screw-up says a lot about how little they cared for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was just seen as a problem to be dealt with, not a person deserving of respect. She was quickly buried in a nameless grave at the Tower Chapel, without the proper Christian rites, as if the king wanted her to be forgotten as fast as she was killed. Henry wanted to erase any memory of Anne after she was gone. He told court painters to destroy her paintings, got rid of her royal symbols from palace walls, and made it clear that saying her name could get you in trouble. While we often think about the act of execution itself, this systematic effort to wipe out Anne's existence was a deeper kind of violence. It was like trying to kill not just a person, but her legacy. It took historians centuries to piece together Anne's life from the scraps that survived Henry's destruction. Her execution also deeply affected those who saw it, especially her ladies-in-waiting who had to clean and prepare her severed head for burial. These women were terrified of being linked to her supposed crimes while doing this horrifying task. Many of them had nightmares for years afterward, and at least one chose to enter a convent because she couldn't bear court life anymore after what she witnessed. The psychological trauma spread far beyond Anne, creating a heavy atmosphere of fear that hung over Henry's court for the rest of his reign. Shortly after the execution, Anne's young daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and cast aside. The child who would grow up to be England's greatest queen found herself alone. Her mother was executed, and her father publicly rejected her. Court documents show that Elizabeth suddenly had no proper clothes or caretakers fitting her former status. Her household fell apart almost overnight. This cruel treatment of a young girl illustrates just one more layer of the horror surrounding Anne's execution. The punishment even reached her innocent child. Most modern stories about Tudor executions miss the intense experience. The scaffold was stained with blood from previous executions, buzzing with flies in the warm May air. The roar of the crowd, manipulated by supporters told to cheer for the Queen's death, created a wall of sound meant to disorient and terrify. As Anne approached Tower Green, that noise only grew louder. The jeers and catcalls echoed from a crowd convinced she was a witch and an adulteress. This carefully planned public humiliation was central to Tudor justice. Death alone was never enough. Popular culture often romanticizes Anne's last speech as a moment of dignified defiance, but history shows a more complex truth. Her carefully chosen words praising the king as a gentle lord reflect her impossible situation. Even facing death, Anne couldn't speak freely. She was worried about her daughter's future and how the crowd would react. Her speech wasn't an act of freedom. It was the ultimate censorship. She knew even her final words would reach the king, affecting those she would leave behind. The sword that took Anne's life came specially from France, symbolizing the showmanship of her execution. Henry pulled out all the stops to make her downfall a grand spectacle. The executioner, it said, practiced on animals first, determined to achieve that clean, single blow to earn his hefty payment. This cold professionalism, reducing Anne's death to a mere technical feat, shows the dehumanization that comes with state-sanctioned execution. Anne wasn't just killed, she was processed through a system designed to turn human suffering into political messaging. Historical accounts reveal that no, the English executioner didn't shy away from the task due to any moral issues. It was all about the French sword technique, which needed specific training. The sword was sharp and balanced differently than the English axe, designed for quick, horizontal strikes instead of heavy downward chops. This choice highlights the dramatic flair of Anne's execution. Even the manner of her death was carefully chosen for maximum effect and minimum mess, ensuring that the spectacle went off without a hitch and no botched beheading. When the sword dropped, Thomas Wyatt, who was stuck in the tower and forced to watch the execution of a woman he once admired, noted the little throat that once wore so many jewels. His poetic words reveal the shocking change of Anne from a crowned queen to a lifeless body. Once her head was severed, Her grieving ladies quickly wrapped it in linen, but not before the executioner held it high by the hair, a traditional sign meant to show the crowd that the sentence was carried out. This gruesome display, with blood still flowing from the severed arteries, left a lasting image in the memories of those who witnessed it. Records from the tower show that Anne's burial was so rushed that she barely received proper Christian rites. Her head and body were placed in a simple arrow chest under the chapel floor, alongside other executed nobles. It was an undignified end for a Queen of England. No marker was set up to show where she lay, and for centuries no one knew the exact spot of her grave. This erasure of even her final resting place illustrates Henry's effort to wipe Anne not just from life, but from history itself, a mission that nearly succeeded. In the days after her execution, Henry's supporters worked hard to control the narrative. Court poets, who had once celebrated Anne's charm and intellect, now wrote poems calling her a cunning adulteress. Official accounts highlighted Henry's supposed mercy in choosing a skilled swordsman instead of the traditional execution method, reshaping his dramatic decision into one of compassion. The horror of the execution was gradually scrubbed clean from the records, starting a long process of historical revision that continues to shape how we view Anne's last moments. What's truly shocking for people today is how quickly things went back to normal for Henry VIII. Just a day after Anne was executed, he got engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks of sending his second wife to the scaffold, he quietly married his third at Whitehall Palace. This cold, swift action shows that to him, Anne's execution was just a solution to a political issue. She hadn't given him a son, so he had her removed and replaced. The tragedy of her death didn't matter to state business and building his dynasty. But it's important to know that Anne's execution wasn't just about the act itself. Leading up to that grim moment, she faced relentless questioning, sleepless nights, and isolation from those who supported her. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, masterminded the accusations against her using methods that resemble modern psychological torture. Confusion, sleep deprivation, isolation, and the clever use of lies. By the time Anne stepped out to face her death, she had already been broken down mentally to ensure she wouldn't put up any fight. Records show there were serious security measures for her execution, way beyond what was standard even for high-profile traitors. The guards were doubled and extra security was placed around the fortress. But this wasn't just to stop her from escaping. It was to make sure no one would try to intervene at the last minute or rally support against the execution. These displays of power also worked to silence anyone sympathizing with Anne, forcing them to comply with the king's orders. The timing of the execution was also thought out. Scheduled for mid-morning instead of the usual dawn, it allowed more Londoners to attend. Tower Green could only hold a handful of nobles and officials, but the tower's height meant crowds outside could hear when it was over. Church bells across London rang out to mark her death, turning this private tragedy into a public spectacle, a display of royal might. This was death as political drama, not just a personal loss. And let's not forget the fate of her co-accused. 5 men faced their own grim endings that day, including her own brother George. Several people were executed just days before Anne on charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths were meant to paint a picture of Anne's supposed crimes before her own execution, making sure that their last words didn't contradict the official story. This coordinated killing of 6 folks, all found guilty on basically the same made-up evidence, stands as one of Tudor England's most shocking acts of state violence. It's almost like a purge. Similar to Stalin's show trials that came later, today Tower Green has a memorial marking where Anne was executed, but records from back then show the actual scaffold was located elsewhere in the Tower complex. This mix-up shows just how often Anne's death has been reshaped and moved around, both in place and in history, to fit different stories. The sanitized and romanticized version of her execution that we see in popular culture doesn't capture the psychological torment, character assassination, and calculated cruelty that colored her last days in May 1536. The true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not just in the act of beheading, but in recognizing it as the peak of a thorough campaign to dismantle a woman who had risen too high for society's comfort. She wasn't just executed, she was methodically unmade. Her reputation was shattered, her accomplishments erased, and her very existence nearly wiped from history. When we look at the full picture of her last days, the psychological torment, the public humiliation, the theatrical cruelty, and the effort to erase her memory, we face a horror that's far more unsettling than just the swift blow of an executioner's sword. From today's perspective, Anne's execution serves as a clear example of state-sanctioned gaslighting and public character assassination. The charges against her, including adultery with multiple men, even her brother, and plotting to poison the king, were so ridiculous they wouldn't hold up in any modern court. Yet, through clever manipulation of public opinion, strategic torture to force confessions from others involved, and strict control of the official narrative, Henry's government managed to convince many that Anne deserved her fate. This systematic twisting of reality may be the most disturbing part of her execution. 500 years later, Anne Boleyn's execution still captivates us. Why? Because it cuts to the core of personal heartbreak and political maneuvering. Her death wasn't just the end of her life. It was a carefully staged event meant to validate a king's decisions and alter how history remembers her. The real nightmare isn't just in the moment the blade fell, it's realizing how power can twist the truth. This sobering lesson hits home, especially in times when information is manipulated and reputations are tarnished. Anne's final sorrow might be that, despite Henry trying to wipe her from the history books, her death rather than her life became her lasting legacy. When we look closely at the true horror of her execution, we face tough realities about power, gender, and how history gets shaped. The polished story of her death, that of a tragic queen experiencing a swift and dignified end, hides the systematic misuse of state power that her situation embodies. By digging into the psychological aspects of her execution, the calculated torment, the public shaming, the ruin of her name, and the attempt to erase her from memory, we can learn more than just about justice today. We see how authority keeps its grip by controlling both lives and the stories told about them. In the image of Anne's severed head, we find a chilling reminder about the vulnerability of truth when faced with overwhelming power.